Baby discovered a bear cub hiding under a restaurant table. What happened next? Melted hearts. The rain had been falling since dawn that morning. Not the heavy kind that sends people running for shelter, but the soft, persistent drizzle that turns the world into a watercolor painting. The Pinecone Cafe sat at the very edge of the forest, where the last street lamp of the small town gave way to towering pine trees that seemed to touch the gray clouds above. It was the kind of place that locals kept secret from tourists, a warm pocket of comfort where the coffee was always fresh and the pie was always homemade. The windows were fogged from the warmth inside meeting the cool October air outside, and through those misty panes, you could just make out the dark silhouettes of the forest, mysterious and ancient. Ethan Marshall pushed open the heavy wooden door, holding it for his wife Jessica Brooks and their daughter Lily Morgan. The little bell above the door chimed softly, a sound that had welcomed visitors to this place for over 50 years. The warmth hit them immediately, along with the smell of cinnamon rolls baking in the kitchen and the rich aroma of dark roast coffee. Lily, who had just turned 4 last month, immediately pressed her small hands against the glass display case near the entrance, her eyes wide as she looked at the rows of pastries and cakes. Her breath fogged the glass as she whispered the names of each treat she recognized, her voice filled with the kind of wonder only children possess when faced with such delicious possibilities. They found a table near the back corner, one of those heavy oak tables that had been there since the cafe opened. The wood was worn smooth from decades of elbows and conversations, and someone had carved initials into one corner long ago, now faded but still visible if you knew where to look. Jessica helped Lily into her chair, the one with the extra cushion so she could reach the table properly, while Ethan hung their rain-dampened coats on the hooks along the wall. The cafe was quiet that afternoon, just a few other patrons scattered throughout the cozy space. An elderly couple sat by the window, sharing a slice of apple pie and watching the rain. A young man with a laptop occupied a corner booth, his coffee cup empty but his focus intense on whatever filled his screen. The waitress, a woman named Margaret, who had worked there for as long as anyone could remember, brought them menus even though they already knew what they wanted. It was part of the ritual, part of what made this place special. She ruffled Lily's hair gently and asked about her new coloring book, the one Lily clutched in her small hands like a treasure. While Ethan and Jessica discussed whether to share the soup of the day or each get their own, Lily had already spread her crayons across the table, carefully selecting the perfect shade of green for the tree she was drawing. The crayons rolled slightly on the uneven wood, and she had to keep pushing them back toward the center of the table. The soup arrived steaming in heavy ceramic bowls, accompanied by thick slices of bread still warm from the oven. The butter melted instantly when spread, disappearing into the soft interior of the bread. They ate slowly, savoring not just the food but the moment itself. Outside, the rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows, creating rivers that raced down the glass before pooling on the windowsill. Lily alternated between spoonfuls of soup and adding details to her drawing, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration as she worked on getting the leaves just right. It happened when Lily reached for the yellow crayon. Her small fingers stretched across the table, but the crayon had rolled just out of reach. She leaned further, her chair creaking slightly but still couldn't quite grasp it. Then, with the determination that only young children possess when something they want is just beyond their reach, she slipped down from her chair and ducked under the table. The tablecloth, a red and white checkered pattern that had seen better days, created a small tent-like space underneath. Ethan and Jessica continued their conversation about weekend plans, not paying much attention to their daughter's crayon retrieval mission. After all, she often spent time under tables, creating imaginary worlds in those small, hidden spaces that adults had long forgotten how to see. But then the seconds stretched longer than they should have. The normal sounds of a child searching for something, the shuffling, the small frustrated sighs, were absent. Instead, there was complete silence from beneath the table. Jessica paused mid-sentence, her spoon halfway to her mouth, and exchanged a glance with Ethan. That parental instinct, finely tuned to detect when something shifts from normal to unusual, kicked in simultaneously for both of them. "Lily?" Jessica called softly, not wanting to disturb the other diners but needing to check on her daughter. "Did you find your crayon, sweetheart?" More silence followed, but it wasn't the concerning kind that makes a parent's heart race. It was the deep, absorbed silence of a child who has discovered something fascinating. Then, very slowly, Lily's head emerged from under the tablecloth. Her eyes were wide, wider than when she had seen the dessert case, and her small face held an expression of such pure wonder that both parents immediately leaned forward. She raised one tiny finger to her lips, the universal gesture for quiet that she had learned from them, and whispered in the smallest voice imaginable, "There's a secret under here. A really special secret." Ethan smiled, assuming his daughter had found an interesting pattern in the wood grain, or perhaps a forgotten toy from another child's visit. But Jessica noticed something else in Lily's expression, something that went beyond normal childhood discovery. There was a reverence there, a careful amazement that seemed too profound for a 4-year-old's usual findings. "What kind of secret, baby?" Jessica asked, matching her daughter's whisper. Lily glanced back under the table, as if checking that the secret was still there, then looked back at her parents. "It's alive," she breathed, "and it's scared." The words hung in the air for a moment, transforming the comfortable atmosphere of the cafe into something charged with mystery. Ethan's first instinct was practical concern. Perhaps a mouse or a stray cat had somehow found its way inside. But the way Lily said "scared" held such empathy, such genuine concern, that he found himself moving slowly, carefully, not wanting to frighten whatever creature his daughter had discovered. He lowered himself from his chair, his knees protesting slightly as he bent down to peer under the table. Jessica did the same from her side, both parents now crouched like children about to share a secret in a blanket fort. What they saw in that shadowy space beneath the table made them both freeze, their breath catching in their throats. Pressed against the central pedestal of the table, in the darkest corner where the shadows were deepest, was a bear cub. But this wasn't the kind of bear cub you might imagine from storybooks or nature documentaries. This was tiny, impossibly small, no bigger than a house cat and probably only a few months old. Its fur was dark brown, almost black in the dim light, and its entire body was trembling. Not the aggressive trembling of an animal about to attack, but the deep, bone-deep shaking of a creature that was utterly terrified and completely lost. The cub's eyes were what held them all frozen in that moment. They were dark, liquid pools that reflected the small amount of light filtering under the tablecloth, and in them was an intelligence that seemed far too knowing for such a young animal. It wasn't looking at them with the blank stare of a wild creature, but with something that seemed almost like recognition, or perhaps hope. Its tiny paws were tucked beneath its body, making it appear even smaller, and its ears were pressed flat against its head. A small whimpering sound, so quiet it was barely audible, escaped from the cub, and that sound contained all the loneliness and fear in the world. Jessica's maternal instinct kicked in immediately, not just for her daughter but for this lost, frightened baby. She had to physically stop herself from reaching out to comfort it, knowing that even a scared cub was still a wild animal. Ethan's mind was racing through practical concerns. How did it get here? Where was its mother? Was it dangerous? But all of those thoughts were secondary to the immediate reality of this impossible situation. Here, in their favorite cafe, in the middle of an ordinary lunch on a rainy afternoon, they had discovered something extraordinary hiding in the shadows. Lily, meanwhile, had slowly lowered herself back under the table, moving with the kind of careful grace that children sometimes display when they instinctively understand the gravity of a situation. She sat cross-legged on the floor, about 3 feet from the cub, and simply watched it. There was no fear in her posture, no tension in her small body. She looked at the bear cub the way she might look at a butterfly that had landed on a flower, with complete fascination and a desire not to disturb something beautiful and fragile. The cub, sensing perhaps that this smallest human was the least threatening, shifted slightly. Its trembling decreased just a fraction, though its eyes remained wide and watchful. "We need to tell someone," Ethan whispered, though even as he said it, he wasn't moving to stand up. There was something about this moment, something about the way the cub was looking at them, that made it feel wrong to break the spell by involving others. But Jessica was already thinking the same practical thoughts. "Margaret," she said softly, referring to their waitress, "she'll know what to do. Her husband used to be a park ranger." But still, neither of them moved. They remained frozen in their positions. 3 humans and 1 tiny bear, connected by something invisible but undeniable. It was Lily who broke the stillness, but not in the way they expected. She slowly, so slowly that it seemed she was moving through honey, extended her small hand. Not reaching for the cub, but placing her palm flat on the wooden floor between them. It was an offering, an invitation, a bridge between 2 different worlds. The cub's eyes tracked the movement, its little nose twitching as it tried to understand this gesture. Then, in a movement that seemed to surprise even the cub itself, it uncurled slightly and stretched its own tiny paw forward, not quite touching Lily's hand, but mirroring the gesture. That's when Margaret appeared, having noticed the family's unusual behavior from across the cafe. She approached with the quiet efficiency of someone who had dealt with many unexpected situations over the years. But when she saw what they were looking at, even her composed expression cracked into amazement. "Oh, my stars," she breathed, immediately understanding the delicacy of the situation. Without being asked, she moved to the front of the cafe and quietly turned the sign from open to closed, then began softly explaining to the few other patrons that there was a small situation that needed to be handled. The elderly couple and the young man with the laptop gathered their things without complaint, sensing that something unusual was happening. As Margaret made a quiet phone call to her husband, who still had connections with the local wildlife services, the cub did something unexpected. It slowly emerged from its hiding spot, not completely, but enough to reveal more of itself. It was even smaller than they had first thought, probably no more than 8 weeks old. Its fur was matted in places, suggesting it had been on its own for at least a day or 2. But what caught everyone's attention was what it did next. The cub carefully, deliberately, pushed something toward Lily with its nose. It was a pine cone, small and perfect, that must have been carried in from outside on someone's shoe. The cub nudged it once, twice, then looked directly at Lily, then toward the window where the forest was visible through the rain, then back at Lily again. "It's trying to tell us something," Lily said with the absolute certainty that children possess when they know something that adults are too complicated to understand. She picked up the pine cone gently, examining it as if it held all the secrets of the universe. The cub watched her intently, and when she looked back at it, it made another small sound. Not a whimper this time, but something else. Something that sounded almost like communication. It was then that Ethan noticed something else. The cub wasn't just looking at them anymore. Its gaze kept shifting to the window, to the forest beyond, and there was something urgent in those glances. The story was unfolding in a way none of them could have predicted. This wasn't just a lost cub that had wandered into the cafe seeking warmth. This was something else. Something more purposeful. The way it had chosen to reveal itself to Lily. The way it had offered the pine cone like a message. The way it kept looking toward the forest. All of it suggested that this small creature had come here deliberately, seeking something specific. But what could a tiny bear cub possibly need from humans that it couldn't find in its natural habitat? Margaret's husband, Tom, arrived within 15 minutes, though it felt like hours, as they all remained in their strange tableau around the table. Tom was a man who had spent 40 years working with wildlife, and his approach was calm and measured. He didn't immediately try to capture or contain the cub. Instead, he observed, taking in the unusual behavior that even his experienced eyes found remarkable. "In all my years," he said softly, "I've never seen anything quite like this. This little one isn't behaving like a normal lost cub. It's like it came here on purpose." The cub seemed to understand that Tom was different from the others, someone who might understand what it was trying to communicate. It emerged fully from under the table now, though it stayed close to Lily, who had remained perfectly still throughout everything. The cub walked, and it was clearly an effort, as if it had traveled a long way, to the window nearest their table. It stood on its hind legs, tiny paws against the glass, and looked out into the forest. Then it turned back to look at them, particularly at Tom, and made a sound that was different from before. It was urgent, almost pleading. Tom studied the cub for a long moment, then made a decision that went against every protocol he had learned in 4 decades of wildlife management. "I think we should follow it," he said, causing everyone to look at him in surprise. "I know how that sounds, but this cub is trying to tell us something, maybe about its mother. Maybe she's injured or trapped. Bears are intelligent creatures, more than most people realize. And this little one..." He paused, watching as the cub continued its attempts to communicate. "This little one is special." The idea of following a bear cub into the forest on a rainy October afternoon should have seemed absurd. Dangerous, even. But something about the situation, about the way everything had unfolded, made it feel like the only right thing to do. Jessica looked at Ethan, a silent conversation passing between them. Could they really take their 4-year-old daughter into the forest following a bear cub? But when they looked at Lily, she was already standing, still holding the pine cone, with the expression of complete trust and determination on her small face. "We have to help," she said simply, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. Tom had brought basic supplies from his truck, a first aid kit, rope, a flashlight even though it was still afternoon, and importantly, a tranquilizer gun that he hoped he wouldn't need. He assured Ethan and Jessica that he would keep them at a safe distance from any potential danger, but something told him that danger wasn't what awaited them in the forest. The cub seemed to understand that they had agreed to follow. It moved toward the door, looking back every few steps to ensure they were coming. As they prepared to leave the warm safety of the cafe, Jessica wrapped Lily in her rain jacket, pulling the hood up over her daughter's head. The rain had lessened to a fine mist, but the forest would be wet and cool. Margaret handed them a thermos of hot chocolate and some cookies wrapped in napkins, a gesture that seemed both practical and somehow ceremonial, as if they were embarking on a quest that required provisions. The elderly couple who had been eating pie earlier had returned, standing at a respectful distance but clearly curious about what was happening. Word had already begun to spread through the small town. Something extraordinary was occurring at the Pinecone Cafe. The cub waited at the door with a patience that seemed beyond its years. When Tom opened it, the small creature stepped out into the misty afternoon and immediately turned toward the forest. It didn't run or scamper like you might expect from a young animal. Instead, it walked with purpose, occasionally stopping to ensure its human followers were keeping up. The path it chose wasn't random. It followed a deer trail that Tom recognized, one that led deeper into the woods but was relatively easy to navigate. The forest in the rain was a different world from the one most people knew. Every surface was jeweled with water droplets, and the usual sounds were muffled by the constant drip, drip, drip from the canopy above. The smell of wet earth and pine filled their nostrils, and their feet made soft, squelching sounds on the muddy trail. Lily walked between her parents, each of them holding one of her hands, but her eyes never left the small figure of the cub moving ahead of them. Tom led the way, his experienced eyes reading the forest for any signs of danger or distress. They had been walking for about 10 minutes when they found the first sign. It was a tuft of fur, caught on a low branch at about adult bear height. The fur was the same color as the cub's, but longer, suggesting an adult bear had passed this way. Tom examined it carefully, noting that some of the fur had been pulled out rather than simply brushed off, indicating the bear had been moving quickly or roughly through this area. The cub stopped when they found the fur, looking back at them with those expressive eyes, as if confirming that yes, this was part of what it wanted them to see. The trail became more difficult as they continued, with fallen logs to navigate around and places where the path almost disappeared entirely. But the cub never hesitated, clearly knowing exactly where it was going. It was leading them steadily uphill, toward a part of the forest that Tom knew was rarely visited by hikers. The trees grew denser here, their branches creating a canopy so thick that even less rain reached the forest floor. The light was dimmer, giving everything a twilight quality even though it was only mid-afternoon. Then they heard it, a sound that made them all stop in their tracks. It was low, mournful, and unmistakably the sound of an animal in distress. The cub's entire body tensed at the sound, and it made a small crying noise in response. Without waiting for the humans, it began to move faster, its little legs working hard to climb over roots and rocks. Tom motioned for the family to stay back while he moved forward more cautiously, but Lily pulled free from her parents' hands and followed the cub before they could stop her. What they found in the small clearing ahead was both heartbreaking and remarkable. A full-grown female bear, obviously the cub's mother, was trapped. Her back leg was tangled in what looked like an old fishing net that had somehow become wrapped around the exposed roots of a fallen tree. The net had cut into her fur, and she had clearly been struggling for some time. The ground around her was torn up from her attempts to free herself, and she looked exhausted. But what struck everyone most was her eyes. They held the same intelligence, the same depth of emotion that they had seen in her cub. When the mother bear saw her baby approaching with humans in tow, her first instinct was protective. She made a warning sound, low and rumbling, that made everyone except Tom take a step back. But the cub ran to her, making small chirping noises that seemed to be explaining something. The mother's eyes moved from her cub to the humans, particularly lingering on Lily, who still held the pine cone. There was a long moment of tension, where anything could have happened. Then, remarkably, the mother bear seemed to understand. She stopped struggling against the net and lay still, her eyes never leaving Tom as he slowly approached. "This is unprecedented," Tom whispered, more to himself than to the others. "She's actually letting me help." He worked carefully but quickly, using a knife from his kit to cut through the tough nylon netting. The mother bear flinched when he first touched the net near her leg, but she remained still, her breathing heavy but controlled. The cub stayed near her head, nuzzling her face and making soft sounds that seemed to comfort her. Lily had crept closer too, despite her parents' attempts to hold her back, and she placed the pine cone on the ground near the mother bear's head, as if returning something that belonged to the forest. It took nearly 20 minutes to free the bear completely. The net had wound around her leg multiple times, and some of it had cut into the skin. But finally, Tom made the last cut, and the net fell away. The mother bear didn't immediately try to stand. She lay there for a moment, breathing heavily, then slowly tested her injured leg. It held her weight, though she was clearly limping. She turned her massive head toward Tom, and in that moment something passed between them. An acknowledgement. A thank you that transcended species and language. What happened next would stay with everyone present for the rest of their lives. The mother bear slowly stood and nudged her cub, checking it over with the careful attention of any mother. Then she did something extraordinary. She gently pushed her cub toward Lily, not aggressively, but in what seemed like a gesture of gratitude, or perhaps recognition of the bond that had formed between the two youngsters. The cub walked over to Lily and for just a moment pressed its small head against her leg. Lily, with the fearlessness of childhood, gently patted its head, her small hand disappearing into the soft fur. The mother bear watched this interaction without any sign of aggression or concern. Then, with a soft grunt to her cub, she began to move toward the deeper forest. The cub followed, but not before looking back one more time at the humans who had helped them. At the edge of the clearing, both bears paused. The mother turned her great head one final time, her eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. Tom, Ethan, Jessica, and finally lingering on Lily. It was a look that held gratitude, understanding, and something else. A recognition of the connection that exists between all living things, even those who seem so different on the surface. As the bears disappeared into the forest, the mist began to lift slightly, and a single ray of sunlight broke through the canopy, illuminating the spot where they had been. The forest seemed to exhale, returning to its normal sounds and rhythms. Birds began to call again, and somewhere in the distance, they could hear the sound of a stream running over rocks. The family stood in silence for a moment, each processing what they had just experienced in their own way. The walk back to the cafe was quiet, contemplative. Lily held both her parents' hands again, but she kept looking back toward where the bears had vanished, as if hoping to see them one more time. Tom led them back along the same path, but it felt different now, charged with the memory of what had occurred. The rain had stopped completely by the time they reached the edge of the forest, and the late afternoon sun was painting everything gold. The Pine Cone Cafe looked exactly the same as when they had left it, but they all knew that they were not the same people who had walked out its door an hour ago. Margaret was waiting for them with fresh hot chocolate and warm towels. She didn't ask for details immediately, sensing that they needed time to process what had happened. Other locals had gathered, drawn by the unusual events, but they too waited respectfully for the story to be told. When Tom finally began to recount what had occurred, his voice held a wonder that his years of experience hadn't diminished. He spoke of the intelligence in the bear's eyes, the deliberate way the cub had sought help, and the mother's incredible trust in allowing humans to free her. As the story spread through the small town over the following days, it grew and changed as stories do. But for Ethan, Jessica, and especially Lily, the truth of what happened was both simpler and more profound than any embellished version. They had been chosen, for reasons they would never fully understand, to be part of something extraordinary. The cub had known somehow that Lily would understand, that she would see past the fear to the need underneath, and the mother had trusted, against every instinct, that these particular humans would help rather than harm. That night, as Jessica tucked Lily into bed, her daughter asked a question that had no easy answer. "Mommy, do you think they'll remember us?" Jessica smoothed her daughter's hair and thought about those intelligent eyes, the deliberate gestures, the moment of connection that had transcended species. "I think they will, sweetheart. I think they will." Lily smiled and closed her eyes, clutching a small stuffed bear that had taken on new significance. As she drifted off to sleep, she whispered, "I'll remember them forever." The experience had changed something fundamental in how they saw the world. The forest that bordered their town was no longer just a collection of trees and trails. It was a living, breathing entity filled with intelligence and emotion that most humans never got to witness. The Pinecone Cafe, already special to them, had become something more. A place where the ordinary world had briefly opened up to reveal the extraordinary that always existed just beneath the surface. Every time they returned for lunch, they found themselves glancing under the table, not really expecting to find another bear cub, but remembering the magic of that rainy afternoon. Tom wrote a report about the incident for the Wildlife Service, but he struggled to capture what had really happened. How could he explain in scientific terms the purposefulness of the cub's behavior, the mother's trust, or the communication that had occurred without words? He settled for the facts. A cub had sought human help for its trapped mother. The mother had been freed without incident, and both bears had returned safely to the wild. But privately, he knew this encounter had been something beyond normal wildlife interaction. It had been a moment of grace, a reminder that humans were not separate from nature but part of it, connected in ways that science was only beginning to understand. The story became part of the town's folklore, told and retold in various versions. Some people embellished it with details that hadn't happened, while others dismissed it as exaggeration. But for those who had been there, the witnesses to this small miracle, no embellishment was necessary. The truth was remarkable enough. A tiny bear cub had walked into a cafe seeking help, had found humans willing to provide it, and had bridged two worlds with trust and intelligence that defied conventional understanding of wild animals. As autumn turned to winter, Ethan and Jessica would sometimes take Lily to the edge of the forest, where they would stand quietly and watch for any sign of the bears. They never saw them again, but occasionally they would find signs, tracks in the snow, claw marks on a tree, a pile of scat that suggested the bears were still in the area, still living their wild lives. Each time, Lily would smile and say, "They're okay," with the certainty of a child who had shared something profound with another living being. The pine cone that Lily had carried into the forest that day sat on a shelf in her room, a tangible reminder of the experience. Sometimes she would hold it and close her eyes, remembering the feeling of the cub's fur under her hand, the look in the mother's eyes, the way the forest had felt different when they were following a purpose bigger than themselves. Her parents noticed that she had developed a deep respect for all living things after that day, an understanding that every creature had its own intelligence, its own emotions, its own story. The Pinecone Cafe added a small carved bear to their sign, a subtle nod to the extraordinary event that had occurred there. Margaret would sometimes tell the story to new customers, especially families with young children, always ending with the same observation. You never know when magic is going to walk through that door. You just have to be ready to recognize it when it does. The table where it all began became quietly famous, with locals requesting it specifically, hoping perhaps that some of the magic might linger there. But the real magic wasn't in the place, or even in the extraordinary event itself. It was in the reminder that the world was far more interconnected than most people realized. Every creature, from the smallest insect to the largest bear, was part of an intricate web of life that humans were privileged to be part of. The cub's trust, the mother's gratitude, Lily's fearless compassion. These were all threads in that web, creating a pattern of connection that was both ancient and immediate. As the seasons cycled through and years passed, Lily grew older but never forgot that afternoon. It shaped her in subtle ways, influencing her choice to study wildlife biology in college, her patient approach to understanding animal behavior, her belief that communication could transcend language. She would often think about the cub, wondering if it had grown strong and wild, if it had cubs of its own now, if it ever stood at the edge of the forest and remembered the small human girl who had helped save its mother. The story took on different meanings for different people. For Ethan, it was a reminder that being a protector sometimes meant knowing when to help and when to simply witness. For Jessica, it reinforced her belief in the importance of teaching children to be brave and compassionate, even in uncertain situations. For Tom, it was the culmination of a lifetime working with wildlife. Proof that the animals he had devoted his life to understanding were far more complex than even he had imagined. For Margaret, it was confirmation that her little cafe was indeed a special place where ordinary afternoons could transform into extraordinary memories. But perhaps the deepest truth of that day was something simpler and more profound. In a world that often seemed divided between human and nature, civilized and wild, safe and dangerous, a small bear cub had demonstrated that these divisions were artificial. We were all part of the same story, all struggling with the same basic needs for safety, family, and connection. The mother bear's trust in humanity's capacity for kindness, despite all the reasons she had to fear humans, was a gift that carried responsibility. It was a reminder that we could choose to be worthy of that trust, to be the kind of humans that a desperate animal would turn to for help. Looking back at that afternoon in the Pinecone Cafe, it was tempting to focus on the extraordinary nature of what had occurred. But the more time passed, the more it seemed that perhaps such connections weren't as rare as people thought. Perhaps they happened all the time, in small ways that most people missed because they weren't looking for them. A bird that sang outside a window during a difficult moment, a butterfly that landed on a shoulder when someone needed a sign, a cat that appeared on a doorstep just when loneliness was becoming unbearable. Maybe these were all versions of the same thing, the natural world reaching out to remind humans that they were never truly alone. The rain returned many times to that small town at the edge of the forest, and each time it did, those who had been part of that October afternoon found themselves thinking about the bears. They wondered if the mother's leg had healed completely, if the cub was learning all the things it needed to know to survive in the wild, if they were warm and dry in some hidden den deep in the forest. These thoughts were comforting, like checking on distant friends, even though the friendship had lasted only an hour on a single afternoon. Sometimes, late at night when the town was quiet and the forest sounds carried on the wind, people would report hearing bears near the edge of town. Not threatening or destructive, just present, as if checking on the humans the way the humans wondered about them. Tom would get calls about these sightings, but he rarely investigated. He knew, with the instinct of someone who had spent a lifetime reading animal behavior, that these visits were intentional but harmless. The bears remembered, just as the humans did, and perhaps they too found comfort in the proximity to those who had once helped them. The lesson of that day rippled outward in ways no one could have predicted. Children who heard the story grew up with a different understanding of wildlife, seeing animals not as threats or resources, but as fellow travelers on this planet. Adults who had become disconnected from nature found themselves taking walks in the forest, paying attention to the small signs of life around them, remembering that they were part of something larger. The town itself seemed to develop a different relationship with the forest that bordered it, more respectful, more aware of the intelligence that lived just beyond the tree line. Years later, when Lily had children of her own, she would take them to the Pinecone Cafe and tell them the story. Not as a fairy tale or a legend, but as a true thing that had happened to their mother when she was very small. She would show them the table, now worn even smoother by countless meals and conversations, and help them understand that extraordinary things could happen to ordinary people if they were open to the possibility. She would teach them to look at animals with respect and curiosity rather than fear, to understand that intelligence and emotion existed in many forms, not just human ones. The pine cone still sat on a shelf, now in Lily's own home, a little more dried and fragile, but still intact. Sometimes her children would ask to hold it, treating it with the reverence usually reserved for family heirlooms, which in a way it was. It was a physical link to a moment when the boundaries between human and wild had dissolved, when trust had transcended species, when a small act of kindness had revealed the interconnectedness of all life. They understood, in the way children do, that this wasn't just a story about bears. It was a story about courage, compassion, and the magic that existed in the world for those who knew how to see it. The Pinecone Cafe continued to serve its coffee and pie, to provide a warm refuge from the rain, to be a gathering place for the community. But for those who knew the story, it was also something more. It was a place where the impossible had happened, where a wild creature had sought help and found it, where humans had risen to an unexpected challenge with grace and courage. The carved bear on the sign weathered and aged, but it remained, a quiet testament to the afternoon when everything changed. In the grand scheme of things, saving one bear and her cub might seem like a small event. The forest was full of dramas and struggles that humans never witnessed, countless stories of survival and loss that played out beyond human awareness. But for those who had been part of that October afternoon, it was a reminder that small acts could have profound meaning. The choice to help rather than fear, to trust rather than retreat, to see intelligence and emotion in non-human eyes, these were choices that defined not just a moment, but a worldview. As the years passed and the story became part of the town's identity, newcomers would sometimes express skepticism. A bear cub walking into a cafe? A mother bear allowing humans to help her? It sounded like something from a children's book rather than real life. But then they would meet Lily, now grown, and see the quiet certainty in her eyes when she told the story. They would talk to Tom, elderly now but still sharp, and hear the wonder that still colored his voice when he described the mother bear's trust. They would sit in the Pinecone Cafe and feel something in the atmosphere, a sense of possibility that made the impossible seem suddenly plausible. The forest itself seemed to hold the memory of that day. Hikers would sometimes report feeling watched, not in a threatening way but with a sense of benevolent awareness. They would find tracks that seemed to parallel the human trails, as if the bears were maintaining their own paths through the woods, separate but connected to the human world. Park rangers noticed that bear-human conflicts in the area were remarkably rare, as if there was an understanding. A treaty, written not in words but in actions, and remembered across generations. Scientists would probably explain it all differently. They would talk about habituation, about learned behaviors, about the adaptive intelligence of bears. They might point out that the cub's behavior, while unusual, wasn't impossible, that animals in distress had been known to seek human help before. They would be right, in their way. But they would also be missing something essential about what had happened that day, the quality of connection that transcended scientific explanation, the moment of recognition between species that suggested consciousness and emotion were not unique to humans. The story eventually spread beyond the small town, carried by visitors who heard it at the cafe, by relatives who were told it at family gatherings, by travel blogs that discovered this quirky local legend. But something was always lost in the retelling by those who hadn't been there. They couldn't capture the quality of light in the forest that afternoon, the expression in the mother bear's eyes, the perfect trust with which Lily had reached out to comfort a frightened wild animal. They couldn't convey the transformation that occurred in those who witnessed it, the shift in perspective that came from realizing that the divide between human and nature was an illusion. For Ethan and Jessica, watching their daughter grow up with this experience as part of her foundation was its own kind of magic. They saw how it influenced her choices, her compassion, her understanding of her place in the world. She never developed the fear of nature that so many children learned, but neither was she reckless. She understood that wild animals deserved respect and space, but also that they were capable of communication and connection if approached with the right intentions. She became the kind of person who could sit still in the forest for hours, watching and listening, understanding that she was not an observer of nature, but a participant in it. The bears were never seen again in such a direct way, but their presence was felt. Sometimes, on particularly misty mornings, someone would spot a large shape moving through the trees at the forest's edge. Occasionally, a perfect paw print would appear in the mud near the cafe's back door, as if someone had come to check that all was well. Once, years later, Margaret found a small pile of pine cones arranged deliberately on the cafe's doorstep, and while there was no way to prove it was anything more than coincidence, those who knew the story had their own ideas about who might have left them there. The lesson that emerged from that extraordinary afternoon was both simple and profound. The world was full of intelligence and emotion that humans rarely recognized. Every creature, from the smallest to the largest, had its own experience of being alive, its own relationships and needs and ways of understanding the world. The cub's decision to seek human help, the mother's trust, the successful rescue. These weren't miracles so much as glimpses into the real nature of life on Earth, where cooperation and communication could transcend the boundaries that humans had created in their minds. As the story settled into legend, it continued to influence the community in subtle ways. The town became known for its progressive wildlife policies, creating corridors for animals to move safely through human-populated areas. The local school developed a renowned environmental education program, inspired by Lily's story. The Pinecone Cafe became a pilgrimage site of sorts for people interested in human-wildlife connections, though most visitors left slightly disappointed that bears didn't regularly appear under the tables. But for those who had been there, who had witnessed the original event, no pilgrimage was necessary. They carried the experience with them always, a touchstone that reminded them of what was possible when fear gave way to compassion, when the artificial boundaries between human and nature dissolved. They knew that they had been part of something rare and precious, a moment when the universe had revealed one of its secrets, that all life was connected, that communication didn't require words, and that trust could bridge even the widest seeming gaps. The afternoon had started with nothing more remarkable than a family lunch on a rainy day. It had ended with a profound shift in understanding about the nature of life, intelligence, and connection. The bears had returned to their wildlife, and the humans had returned to their civilized one, but both had been changed by the encounter. The forest and the town, the wild and the domestic, the human and the animal. These were no longer separate worlds, but part of a single, interconnected system where extraordinary things could happen when beings recognized each other across the divide of species. In quiet moments, usually when rain was pattering against windows and the world felt soft and possible, those who had been part of that day would think about the bears. They would wonder if the mother ever told her cub, in whatever way bears share such things, about the day the humans helped them. They wondered if the cub, grown now with cubs of its own perhaps, remembered the small human girl who had shown no fear, only kindness. They wondered if, somewhere in the genetic memory of those bears, there was a knowledge that not all humans were to be feared, that some could be trusted in moments of desperate need. The truth was that it didn't matter whether the bears remembered in the way humans understood memory. What mattered was that the encounter had happened, that trust had been offered and honored, that help had been given and received. In a world that often seemed dominated by conflict and division, this small story of cooperation across species boundaries was a reminder of what was possible. It suggested that the solutions to many of the world's problems might lie not in separation and dominance, but in recognition and cooperation, in seeing the intelligence and emotion that existed in all forms of life. The Pinecone Cafe still stands at the edge of the forest, still serves its coffee and pie, still provides a warm refuge from the rain. The table where it all began is still there, worn smooth by countless meals and conversations. The carved bear on the sign has weathered to a soft patina that makes it look like it has always been there. And sometimes, on rainy October afternoons, when the mist rolls in from the forest and the world feels full of possibility, people still glance under the tables, not really expecting to find a bear cub, but hoping, always hoping, that magic might walk through the door again. The story has become more than just a local legend. It has become a reminder that extraordinary things happen not in distant places or to special people, but right here, right now, to anyone who is open to the possibility. It suggests that every moment holds the potential for connection across difference, for communication beyond words, for trust that transcends fear. The bear cub that walked into the Pinecone Cafe that October afternoon brought more than just a request for help. It brought a gift, the knowledge that we are all part of something larger, more intelligent, and more interconnected than we usually remember. 2 chapters of Mentioned Part has completed. As the evening deepened and the cafe finally closed for the night, Margaret stood for a moment in the doorway, looking out at the forest. Somewhere out there, 2 bears were living their wild lives, probably never thinking about the humans who had helped them. But the connection remained, invisible but real, a thread in the great web of life that connected all living things. She turned off the lights and locked the door. But the magic of that afternoon remained, warming the space like the memory of a fire long after the flames have died. The town slept peacefully that night, as it did most nights, cradled between the civilized world and the wild one. But for those who knew the story, who had been part of it or heard it told with the ring of truth, the boundary between those worlds seemed less solid. They knew that at any moment, the ordinary could become extraordinary. That help could come from unexpected places, that trust could bridge any gap. They knew that they were part of a larger story, one that included every creature that walked, flew, swam, or crawled on this small planet spinning through the vast darkness of space. In the years that followed, there would be other encounters, other moments when the wild world and the human world touched. But none would quite match the purity of that October afternoon when a tiny bear cub walked into a cafe and changed everyone who witnessed it. It remained the gold standard of human-wildlife interaction, a perfect example of what was possible when fear gave way to compassion, when intelligence recognized intelligence across the boundary of species. Lily grew up, as children do, but she never grew out of the wonder of that day. It informed her work as a wildlife biologist, her approach to conservation, her belief in the possibility of coexistence between humans and nature. She would often tell her colleagues that the most important thing she had learned hadn't come from textbooks or lectures, but from a tiny bear cub that had trusted her when she was 4 years old. That trust had been a responsibility and a gift, shaping her into someone who could see the world through multiple perspectives, who understood that human intelligence was just one form among many. The mother bear and her cub presumably lived out their natural lives in the forest, their story unknown, except for that one extraordinary chapter when their path had crossed with humans. But in the larger story of the forest, their survival mattered. The cub would grow up to have cubs of its own, passing on not just genes but perhaps some cellular memory of the day when humans had been helpers rather than threats. The forest itself seemed to remember, becoming a place where the boundary between wild and civilized was more permeable, where extraordinary encounters were always possible. The pine cone that Lily had carried that day eventually became fragile with age, but she preserved it carefully, understanding that it was more than just a memento. It was a physical link to a moment when the impossible had happened, when trust had transcended species, when a child's compassion had helped save 2 lives. Her own children would hold it carefully, feeling the weight of the story it represented, understanding that they were part of a family that had been chosen for something extraordinary. As the world changed around them, becoming more urbanized, more separated from nature, the story of the bear cub in the cafe became even more important. It was a reminder of what was being lost, but also what could still be saved. It suggested that the solution to the environmental crisis might not lie just in policy and technology, but in recognition, recognizing the intelligence and emotion that existed throughout the natural world, recognizing our kinship with all living things, recognizing that we were not separate from nature but part of it. The Pinecone Cafe became a symbol of this possibility, a place where the ordinary and extraordinary coexisted, where a cup of coffee and a slice of pie could be the prelude to a life-changing encounter. People came from far away hoping to experience their own moment of magic, though most left with nothing more than a good meal and a story to tell. But for those who lived in the town, who passed the cafe every day on their way to work or school, it was a constant reminder that they lived in a place where magic had actually happened. Tom, the retired park ranger who had helped free the mother bear, spent his final years giving talks at schools and community centers, sharing not just the facts of what had happened, but the feeling of it. He would describe the intelligence in the mother bear's eyes, the purposefulness of the cub's behavior, the moment when trust had overcome instinct. He would always end his talks the same way, by saying that everyone had the capacity to be part of such a moment, but only if they were willing to see animals as more than just animals, to recognize the consciousness that existed in many forms. The story spread through academic circles as well, cited in papers about animal intelligence, used as a case study in wildlife management courses, debated by scientists who tried to explain the behavior in purely biological terms. But something was always lost in the academic analysis, some essential quality that couldn't be quantified or studied. It was the quality of grace, the moment when all the rules and expectations fell away and something pure and true emerged. It was the quality that made people who heard the story firsthand fall silent, understanding that they were hearing about something sacred. As environmental challenges mounted and the relationship between humans and nature became increasingly strained, the story of the bear cub took on new relevance. It became a parable for what was possible if humans could overcome their fear and separation from the natural world. It suggested that solutions might come not from dominating nature but from cooperating with it, from recognizing the intelligence that existed in the forest, the ocean, the sky. It proposed that animals might have things to teach humans, if humans could learn to listen. The children who grew up hearing the story developed a different relationship with nature than their parents had. They didn't see the forest as a place to be conquered or feared, but as a community of intelligent beings living their own complex lives. They understood that every creature, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, had its own experience of being alive, its own relationships and needs and ways of understanding the world. This perspective, multiplied across a generation, began to shift the community's entire relationship with the environment around them. Conservation efforts in the area became remarkably successful, not because of enforcement or regulation, but because of genuine care and understanding. People made choices that benefited wildlife not out of obligation, but out of respect and recognition. The forest thrived, becoming a model for how human communities could coexist with wild spaces. And sometimes, on misty mornings or quiet evenings, people would spot bears at the forest's edge, not threatening, but simply present, as if maintaining the connection that had been established that October afternoon. The story eventually became part of the broader mythology of human-animal encounters, joining the ranks of famous tales of interspecies cooperation and communication. But for those who had been there, it remained intensely personal. It was their story, their miracle, their reminder that the world was far more magical than most people realized. They had been chosen, for reasons they would never fully understand, to be part of something that transcended ordinary experience. As Lily reached middle age, she would sometimes return to the cafe and sit at that same table, now marked with a small brass plaque that simply read, October 2024. She would order the soup of the day and sit quietly, remembering. Not nostalgically, but actively, keeping the memory alive and fresh. She would think about the cub, wondering if its descendants still roamed the forest, if they carried some genetic memory of humans who had helped rather than harmed. She would think about her younger self, fearless and open, and try to maintain that same openness to wonder even as an adult. The story's influence rippled outward in ways that couldn't be measured. A child who heard it third hand grew up to become a veterinarian specializing in wildlife rehabilitation. A developer changed his plans after visiting the cafe, deciding to preserve rather than clear a section of forest. A teacher used the story to help her students understand empathy and the importance of helping others, even when those others seemed very different from themselves. Each ripple created more ripples, spreading the essential message that connection across difference was not just possible but necessary. In the end, the story of the bear cub in the Pinecone Cafe was about more than just a remarkable wildlife encounter. It was about the possibility of grace in ordinary moments, the potential for extraordinary connections in everyday places. It was about the intelligence and emotion that existed throughout the living world, waiting to be recognized and respected. It was about the choice to help rather than fear, to trust rather than retreat, to seek kinship rather than difference. The cafe still serves its coffee and pie. The forest still stands at the edge of town. And somewhere in between, in that liminal space where civilization meets wildness, the possibility of magic remains. People still tell the story, each time adding their own understanding, their own meaning to what happened that October afternoon. But the core of it remains unchanged. A small bear cub walked into a cafe seeking help, found humans willing to provide it, and in doing so, reminded everyone present that we are all part of the same story, all connected in ways that we are only beginning to understand. As night falls and the cafe closes, as the forest settles into its nocturnal rhythms, as the town prepares for sleep, the connection remains. It lives in the memories of those who were there, in the stories told to children, in the changed perspectives of all who truly heard what happened. It lives in the understanding that every creature has its own intelligence, its own emotions, its own story. It lives in the recognition that humans are not separate from nature but part of it, capable of communication and cooperation across the boundaries of species. The bears are out there still, living their wild lives, their story intersecting with the human story only in that one extraordinary moment. But that moment was enough. It was enough to change lives, to shift perspectives, to create a legacy of understanding and respect that continues to grow. It was enough to prove that magic is real, that connection is possible, that trust can bridge any gap. It was enough to remind us all that we are part of something larger, more beautiful, and more interconnected than we usually remember to see. In the quiet moments before sleep, when the mind drifts between waking and dreaming. Those who know the story sometimes imagine they can hear it. The soft breathing of bears in the forest, the whisper of wind through pine needles, the gentle patter of rain on leaves. They imagine the mother and cub, safe and free, moving through their world with the same intelligence and purpose that had brought them to the cafe that day. They imagine the threads of connection that link all living things, invisible but unbreakable, creating a web of relationship that encompasses every creature on Earth. And in those moments, the boundary between human and nature dissolves completely. There is no separation, no division, no hierarchy of intelligence or worth. There is only life in all its myriad forms, sharing a single planet, breathing the same air, warmed by the same sun, connected by bonds that transcend species and understanding. The bear's cub's trust, the mother's gratitude, Lily's compassion. These were not extraordinary except in that they were recognized and honored. They were expressions of the connection that always exists, waiting to be acknowledged. The story ends where it began, in a small cafe at the edge of a forest, where ordinary people eat ordinary meals and occasionally, just occasionally, extraordinary things happen. It ends with the understanding that such possibilities exist everywhere, in every moment, for those who have eyes to see and hearts to recognize them. It ends with the knowledge that we are never alone, never separate, never without connection to the larger web of life that surrounds and includes us. As the years pass and the story becomes legend, as the witnesses age and new generations are born, the essential truth remains. We are all part of the same story. The bear cub that walked into the Pinecone Cafe was both an ending and a beginning, a conclusion to one chapter and the opening of another. It was a reminder that every ending is also a beginning, every conclusion an invitation to wonder what happens next, every story part of a larger narrative that includes all life on Earth and perhaps beyond. The forest dreams its ancient dreams. The town sleeps its human sleep. And somewhere in between, in the space where wild meets civilized, where fear meets trust, where different forms of intelligence recognize each other, the magic continues. It continues in every act of kindness across difference, every moment of recognition across species, every choice to help rather than harm. The bear cub's legacy lives not in monuments or museums, but in changed hearts and shifted perspectives, in the understanding that we are all connected, all part of the same beautiful, complex, interconnected web of life. And so the story continues, not in words, but in actions, not in telling, but in living. Every person who heard it and was changed by it carries it forward. Every child who grows up knowing that animals are more than they seem continues the narrative. Every moment of connection across difference adds another chapter. The story that began with a bear cub under a table has no ending, because it is not really about bears or cafes or even that particular October afternoon. It is about the eternal possibility of connection, the endless potential for grace, the infinite ways that life reaches out to life across every boundary and division. In the end, we are all waiting under the table, frightened and lost, hoping for help. We are all the parent, trapped and struggling, needing assistance we cannot ask for. We are all the child, fearless and compassionate, ready to bridge any gap with love. We are all the helpers, capable of overcoming our fear to provide aid. We are all part of the story that continues to unfold, moment by moment. Choice by choice, connection by connection. The Pinecone Cafe stands at the edge of the forest, forever marking the place where the ordinary became extraordinary. But in truth, every place is such a threshold, every moment a potential doorway to wonder. The bear cub's gift was not just the request for help, but the reminder of this truth, that magic is always possible, connection is always available, and we are never as separate as we think we are. In recognizing this, in living this truth, we honor not just that one extraordinary afternoon, but the extraordinary possibility that exists in every ordinary moment. As the stars wheel overhead and the earth continues its ancient rotation, as forests grow and seasons change, as generations pass and stories are told and retold, the essential message remains. We are all connected. The bear cub knew it, the mother trusted it, Lily embodied it, and now everyone who has heard the story knows it too. We are all part of something larger, more intelligent, and more beautiful than we can fully comprehend. And sometimes, if we are very lucky and very open, we get to experience it directly, in moments of pure grace that remind us who we really are and why we are here. The story of the bear cub in the Pinecone Cafe is, in the end, the story of all of us. It is the story of connection across difference, of trust despite fear, of help freely given and gratefully received. It is the story of intelligence recognizing intelligence, of consciousness acknowledging consciousness, of life celebrating life. It is a story that has no ending because it is still being written every day by everyone who chooses connection over separation, love over fear, trust over suspicion. And so we end where we began, with a question that is also an invitation. What would happen if we all recognize the intelligence and emotion that exists throughout the living world? What would happen if we understood that we are not separate from nature but part of it? What would happen if we approached every encounter, whether with human or animal, with the same openness and compassion that Lily showed to the frightened cub under the table? The answer is both simple and profound. Magic would happen. Connection would happen. The world would reveal itself to be far more wonderful than we ever imagined. The bear cub's story is our story. The mother's trust is our challenge. Lily's compassion is our possibility. The Pinecone Cafe is every place where the ordinary meets the extraordinary. The forest is the whole living world, waiting to be recognized and respected. And we, all of us, are part of the same story, the same web, the same magnificent experiment in consciousness and connection that is life on Earth. As we drift toward sleep, as our minds relax and our boundaries soften, we can almost feel it, the presence of all the other lives with whom we share this planet. The bears in their dens, the birds in their nests, the fish in their streams, the insects in their countless hiding places. All of them living their own stories, having their own experiences, contributing their own intelligence to the great collaborative project of life. We are not alone. We have never been alone. We are part of something vast and beautiful and interconnected, something that includes every living thing and perhaps extends beyond what we call life into realms we cannot yet imagine. The bear cub came into the cafe to remind us of this truth. Its mother's trust confirmed it. The successful rescue demonstrated it. And now, as the story spreads and grows and inspires, it continues to work its magic, opening hearts and minds to the possibility of connection across every boundary. This is the true gift of That October Afternoon. Not just a heartwarming story, but a key to understanding our place in the world, our relationship with all life, our potential for grace. Sleep comes gently to those who know they are part of something larger. Dreams flow more freely when we understand that consciousness takes many forms. Peace settles more deeply when we recognize that we are held in a web of connection that includes all life. The bear cub's story becomes our lullaby, reminding us that we are safe, we are connected, we are part of the endless, beautiful story of life on Earth. And somewhere in the forest, perhaps, a bear stirs in its sleep, dreaming its own dreams, living its own story, connected by invisible threads to a cafe at the forest's edge, to a small girl who showed no fear, to all of us who have heard the story and been changed by it. We are all dreaming the same dream, the dream of connection, the dream of a world where trust transcends fear, where help is freely given, where every creature is recognized as part of the same magnificent whole. The story has no ending because life has no ending, only transformation, only continuation in new forms and new stories. The bear cub that walked into the Pinecone Cafe continues to walk through our dreams, our thoughts, our understanding of what is possible. It reminds us always that we are more connected than we know, more capable of grace than we believe, more part of the magic than we remember. And in remembering, in telling the story, in living its truth, we keep the magic alive, passing it forward to new generations who will add their own chapters to the endless story of connection.